Okay, so I
Well,
just want to go over a number of things because Reb Yaakov here, um, I mentioned this many moons ago, maybe more than once, that sometimes when Reb Yaakov likes something, he sort of, I hate to use these words, but it describes it best. He beats it to death. Reb Yaakov will say it 28 different ways. And no, I want you to know that when he spoke publicly, each time he said it a little bit different, right? He had a different proof, and he said it a little bit different. So, so that's why Reb Yaakov Kamenetsky and the fellow who wrote on Chumash, Reb Daniel Neustadt, they recorded a lot of the different speeches that Reb Yaakov gave, or different writings that he wrote from different times in his life. And each time when he added, he said something a little bit different. So on the one hand, it could drive you crazy. But on the other hand, Reb Yaakov was more like a machadish. So we always thought a little bit, okay, let's think more about this. So let's try this on it. That's where Reb Yaakov was. So I just want to recap because the first time we spoke about Ephraim, we spoke about it in terms of what it says in Divrei Hayomim, that the Ephraim, people of Ephraim, the children of Ephraim, left left Egypt early, Mitzrayim early, and they went up. It looks like they went up through Eretz Plishtim, and they were killed. And those are, according to at least one opinion of Chazal, those are the bones that we call the dried bones in Yecheskel that he resurrected. Okay, so Rabbi Yaakov started out by asking the question of why are we saying Ephraim, the children of Ephraim? Why don't we just list off that Ephraim had a number of kids, and part of the tribe of Ephraim left early. Not the whole tribe. It's clear from the text in Divrei Yomim that part of the tribe left. So why we link it to Ephraim? So that's what got Reb Yaakov started on the idea that because they were from the family of Ephraim, that's what pushed them over the edge, so to speak. And he comes up in Divrei Yomim with two different approaches to why Ephraim is listed over there, even though it's only part of Ephraim. They're called the children of Ephraim, because it was Ephraim who had a different type of relationship with Egypt. Okay, and Reb Yaakov goes on to say that there are two. He has two approaches to this. One is that Ephraim was more assimilated than the rest of the children of the tribes, because he not only grew up in Egypt, as opposed to the tribes growing up with Yaakov and Eretz Yisrael, but he was younger than Menashe, and therefore the younger brother many times is even more Egyptian than the older brother. Okay? So Rabbi Yaakov says there's two approaches to this. One approach is that he was more assimilated, and therefore he didn't think he has to wait for the Kates Hayomim. He didn't have to wait for the Geula that's announced by a Mashiach called Moshe Rabbeinu. We don't have to wait. We're very confident. Egypt is not treating us well, right? We're out of here. We don't have to wait for Mashiach to come. There he's being merames to the Medinas Yisrael. That Medinas Yisrael is the Geula. There was a secular people who either went through the Holocaust or they all experienced the Holocaust. Certainly, Ben Gurion, one level or another experienced the Holocaust. They weren't there, but of course they, were there in the sense of they experienced it by reading about it, by being, going to England about it, by people coming after the Holocaust to Eretz Yisrael. So certainly they experienced the Holocaust, right? But they say that, they're not waiting for Mashiach. Ben Gurion wasn't waiting for Mashiach. I'm not saying he felt he's the Mashiach, but he felt that Medinas Yisrael is the Geula. There's no question about it, okay? And that's what Bnei Ephraim felt. That's why Reb Yaakov is being merames. He never says what he's talking about, but what Reb Yaakov wrote over there was in 1935, okay? So, and Reb Yaakov was a staunch, what do you call it, a member of Aguda, as opposed to Mizrahi, which was very strong in Eastern Europe and Lithuania, but he was part of Aguda. So he was saying that, Mizrahi is teaming up with secular Jews who don't feel there's like waiting for Mashiach. They're creating Mashiach, right? And that's what Ephraim did because he was more assimilated. Okay, that's approach one. Approach two is because Ephraim felt more like an Egyptian than even Menashe. He was very what's the word? He was very he felt very betrayed by Egypt. Rabbi Yaakov said that the Germans felt more betrayed by Germany than the Lithuanians by the Lithuanian government because we didn't expect so much out. We didn't become citizens of the country like the Germans did. We didn't, we knew we're never going to be accepted. We didn't even want to be accepted. We're living here, we're helping your economy, we're doing what needs to be done, and that's it. Whereas in Germany, they really felt we're part of Germany, right? By the way, in Hungary, it was similar. When, the Hungarians were shocked when the Germans went in at the end of the war to Hungary, to Budapest, because they felt themselves much more Hungarian than Jewish, right? So Ephraim, growing up in Egypt, felt he was betrayed by the Egyptians. Because my father was a great Egyptian. He took your economy and he made it into a strong economy, which, by the way, Reb Yaakov says the Jews always did that wherever they went, right? And whenever they left, right, or thrown out, the economy didn't stand, it didn't go, didn't stay so great in lands where they were thrown out. So Reb Yaakov brings that up, and he says that, that's the way Ephraim felt. He felt like a German citizen that was betrayed, that was made into a slave. In other words, which is exactly what happened in Germany. In other words, the first camps the German Jews were put into were not death camps; they were slave camps, right? And that's what he said. I'm not taking this. I'm out of here, right? That's the other approach that Rabbi Yaakov has. Okay, and then what we spoke about last week was the fact that another aspect of Ephraim that again is based on the fact that Ephraim is more Egyptian than the other tribes' kids, and then even more than Manasseh. Now, so what did Reb Yaakov talk about last week? He talked about why Ephraim and Manasseh were given special treatment by Yaakov, right? More than the other tribes' grandchildren. Okay, why were they given special treatment? Number one. Number two, he asks, why weren't the tribes very angry? What about my grandchildren? Right? Why is my grandchildren grew up with you in Israel, and they're like more Egyptian. Why don't my kids get your attention? And the answer is that's dafka why they didn't get the attention, because they grew up with Yaakov in Israel. So Yaakov wasn't worried about them. He was worried about Ephraim and Manasseh because they grew up in Egypt. And that's why he says when Yaakov said Ephraim and Manasseh, Keruven and Shimon Yuli, the tribes didn't get jealous. The tribes could have gotten jealous about that. What do you mean? Yosef has two sons that are becoming tribes, and we have our tribe, Reuven, Shimon, Levi. Our children don't get separate tribes or anything. The answer is they understood that Yosef's children need chizuk. And that's why Rashi says that when Yosef was sick, when Yaakov was sick, how did Yosef find out about it? In the text, it just says someone came and told him. Rashi says it was Ephraim, because Ephraim used to hang out by Yaakov because he encouraged him to hang out over there so he would get a Ruach HaTorah, which was not really so much in the culture of, in the values and culture of Egypt, right? So Reb Yaakov goes on to say over here, that's why he picked them, because again, Rabbi Yaakov was working with this idea that Ephraim is more Egyptian, and that's why he's even more Egyptian than Manasseh, and therefore it doesn't say Yaakov learned with Manasseh, but it says Yaakov learned with Ephraim. Because
Shurin, where are you starting from?
I didn't read yet.
Yeah, I know. So where are you going? It looks like you're about
to. Last week was I gave you this week
4 and onward.
pages 4, 5, 6, and 7, right? So the pages before that, hold on one second. There's 2 pages before that.
Right.
It's Ephraim Manasseh. It's in Bereshis. This is in Chumash already. in Vayechi, in Bereshis Mem Ches Pasuk Hey, right? Ephraim, Menashe, Keruven, v'Shimon. So I was just
Okay, yeah,
explaining to
sure.
you the first half of this, right? And that's why Yaakov says, Shnei banecha noladim lecha be'eretz Mitzrayim, right? He says, "V'atosh shnei banecha noladim lecha be'eretz Mitzrayim." He should have just said to Yosef, "Shnei banim noladim lecha." What's be'eretz Mitzrayim? And then he says, "Ephraim and Menashe, Reuven and Shimon Yuli." Right? He says, "Why is he stressing it?" That's exactly why. I need them to feel choshev. I need them to create tribes so they'll feel responsible as Jews, right? Otherwise, they'll be Egyptians. Yaakov was very afraid. So Reb Yaakov is really um, projecting this on our society, right? As he's looking through glasses of our society and projecting it on Ephraim Menashe, being born in Egypt, just like the Germans were already born in Germany, or the Americans are already born in America, or the English are born in England, right? It's not like the first generation, which we all know that your grandparents or great grandparents felt very different about. They loved America or England or whatever it was because they gave them a home, but they felt very different than we feel. Even my parents felt different. I felt more established as a citizen of America than my parents. They didn't have the language as well, right? Which a lot of your grandparents or great grandparents didn't have the language as well, right? And they didn't have the culture as well. If you put on a song from the world of rock and roll of the 50s and 60s, they couldn't relate to it. They thought it was crazy. You put on a symphony, they could relate to it. Russian waltz, they could relate to it. Rabbi Yaakov used to learn Gemara with a Russian waltz. In other words, the tune that he learned in Gemara was a Russian waltz. He never did anything by the Four Seasons or the Beatles, right? Right? He didn't do that, right? Because he may have heard of them, he heard of the Beatles probably heard somewhere, they were very famous. But he related to the music of Russia, even though, of course, he didn't sit and listen to music of Russia either. Rabbi Yaakov was probably more like Ramosha about listening to music the whole year. But the tune he learned by, when I asked him, I said, Zaidi, where'd you get that tune from? So I heard someone sing the Fulachadodis. I said, where'd you get the tune from? He says to me, what do you mean, where'd I get it? It's a Russian waltz. And he said it to me, believe Busha. So that tells you, where Reb Yaakov was. He was living in America. He had tremendous hakaras hatov to America. There's no question about it, right? To that, he saw the downside of the Golus of America being so good to us that you can just assimilate right out if you're not careful, right? And we'll get to this probably this week, if not next week. We'll get to Reb Yaakov's last drasha he gave at the Aguda convention. A very important drasha. He was 92 at the time. And he gave his last drasha. Then after that, he got sick. He couldn't really come anymore. He lived to 95, but he didn't go after that. But the last drasha was a very important drasha. Maybe even knew it might be the last drasha. I'm not sure. Anyway, the point over here is that Rabbi Yaakov was projecting, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, onto Ephraim and Menashe, right? Menashe being a little bit more like Eastern Europe and Ephraim more like Western Europe already, right? Where the Jews felt like, really as citizens and everything. Okay? So that's why.
Shurin?
Well, yes. Question.
If you could, it's very clear to me what you've described as the second theory about Ephraim, that he was so disappointed and disillusioned by Egyptian society, he was ready to leave. But it's not so clear to me. The first shita, the first explanation that he was, I think you described that he was what's the word? I forgot the word.
He was assimilated enough.
Assimilated.
That he felt, right. He didn't feel you have to wait for a geula, like they had a Kabbalah that someone's going to come and say, Pakod Yivkod Hashem, Mizeh. And he said, why do we have to wait for that? We can go right out now.
Because he was assimilated?
Yeah, because he felt you don't have to wait for Mashiach. We could be Mashiach. We could leave. I know what Reb Yaakov was there referring to. I mean, when I learned this piece of Reb Yaakov Kamenetsky, we both came to the same conclusion. Reb Yaakov doesn't mention a word about Medinas Yisrael, but there's no question in our mind. He wrote it in 1935, right? 34, I think, that he was referring to Medinas Yisrael here. Is that the secular people of Medinas Yisrael are not going to wait for Mashiach. Medinas Yisrael is the Mashiach. It is the Geula. This is the way we're going to live the rest of our life. We're not looking forward to something more than this. In the secular world, I'm talking about, right? Not the religious world. I'm not even talking Dati Lumi. I'm saying the secular world. They're not waiting for a Mashiach to come and bring peace between Israel and the rest of the world. That's not. They have to bring peace themselves. If you ask them, the secular Israeli, we have to make peace, right? According to Reb Yaakov, there'll never be peace without Mashiach, and according to them, that's the only way there'll be peace is with us, because we're not waiting for anybody else, right? So he tries to project that into Ephraim. Ephraim was more assimilated than Manasseh. And of course, in the piece that we learned last week, he says, and the proof is Manasseh is still a Hebrew name and Ephraim is an Egyptian name, right? The Pei and Resh are all over. Shifra, Pua, Tanchampes, Paro, right? Pinchas, right? These are all, I'm sorry to say that, Pinchas, to you, because you had Wayne and then you changed it to Pinchas, and it's still an Egyptian name. You didn't get to the Hebrew yet. So anyway, but I think he might even bring Pinchas as the name as part of that, right? Potiphar, Tzofnas Paneach, Tzofnas, right? Shifra Pua, right? So because there was a place in Egypt called Sanchampes. So it's got the Pinchas in there, So anyway, so Yaakov says that shows that Yosef was already more Egyptian, and he gave him an Egyptian name. Because I want to tell you, I saw this myself. I saw this in my shul. I saw my shul that the people who were older than my father. And it was my father was, when I remember my father in the shul, he was in his 40s, okay? Early 40s. The people in the shul were, some of them in the 60s and 70s, right? And they still use their Jewish name. But the kid that they named Moshe became Morris. And the kid that they named Yitzchak became Isidore, right?
Wow.
Right? I don't know if you guys experienced this, but I mamish experienced. Yeah. So that's what it is. So that's all Reb Yaakov was really saying here is that, okay, it went from, whatever it should have been Ephraim, it went to Ephraim, who was an Egyptian. Reb Yaakov, I said, like he's beating it to death. He's showing you from all different places how assimilated Ephraim was in. He's not going to let it go. He's just going to show it to you because he needs to have this idea that Ephraim left before time. According to Chazal, it's referring to Ephraim and Divrei Yom, and he left before, and therefore, we need to have him being even more assimilated than Menashe. So Reb Yaakov said two things last week, just to sum up. One is the brothers were not jealous of Yaakov paying more attention to Menashe and Ephraim because they realized they need it more, right? And it would be very similar. It would be very similar. I'll give you an example, which takes place in our Jewish population. You have from people, and this goes across the board. I don't care if Dati Lumi or Haredi. I'm talking mostly Chutz La'aretz, but it's probably in Israel too. But I want to pick Chutz La'aretz a little bit clearer. That you have sometimes, right? You have a guy has 3 children or 4 children, a from guy, very from guy. And one of the kids goes off. And now he's raising kids, right? The guy who went off is raising a new generation of secular kids, right? But they have their Zaidi who's Orthodox, right? They have the Zaidi who's Orthodox. The Zaidi might spend more time with them than he would with his other grandchildren because he knows that they need it. The other kids are from. These kids, if you don't spend time with them, there's nothing going to happen. Even if you spend time with them, right? It's a question. I remember as a little kid, my father's stories. I don't remember what the context was, because my father spoke in Yiddish to the people. But there are people already used to come once or twice or three times a year. They come for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. I mean, Yiddish speakers, and the kids were much more assimilated. So I remember my father, and a lot of them brought their kids for Rosh Hashanah. The kids probably drove to their house, and they brought the kids because the kids were living out in the island, and there was no shul. Even in a conservative shul, there wasn't. It was far away. Or the father wanted the kids to daven in an Orthodox shul for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. The parents wanted that. They were Eastern European or born in America, turn of the century. Anyway, so I remember my father getting up on Rosh Hashanah and saying, a grandchild who was not from already, used to go every summer to see his grandparents. His parents were from people. His grandparents were from people. His parents already were not from, but they used to send them to the grandparents to get a little bit of geschmack or even geschmeck of Yahadut. A little bit of a taste of Yahadut. So they would send them for the summer. I have the opposite, by the way. My students are always asking me, can I send my kids to my parents or my grandparents who are not from? I got the opposite. But in these days, it was this way. It was, you send your kids to the from grandparents, the older generation, So the kid spends 2 months with his grandparents and he's getting, his grandfather sits and learns with him Torah, right? And talks to them about Yadus and the Jewish people and Jewish history, right? And he says, and the time is up and the parents come to pick him up, right? So as he's walking out of the house, his grandfather taught him to kiss the mezuzah. So he walks out of the house, he kisses the mezuzah, he says, by God, see you next year. So my father said, guys, it's Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. I know you're going to go out, kiss the mezuzah, and say, Rabbi, we'll see you next year. Don't wait for next year. Come back before that. That's what I remember my father as a little kid saying, right? The idea is, of course, that, the kids are assimilated. They get a little from, and a lot of kids have told me this, that I remember my grandfather put on tefillin, or my great-grandfather put on tefillin, and I remember it, and it made an impression. Even if the kid wasn't so frum, it made an impression of, this is the real Yahadut. You know what I mean? So that's what Yaakov was really doing. That's what Reb Yaakov says. Reb Yaakov was really putting time into them. Now, normally, we don't think about this. That's the important thing about Reb Yaakov. We don't think about Ephraim and Menashe, right? We don't think about them, that they grew up in Egypt as opposed to in Israel. Who talks about that? Reb Yaakov made this into an issue. I don't even know. Maybe you guys could tell me if anybody else talks about it. But Reb Yaakov Mamish made this into a big issue, that we shouldn't assume that they were raised the same way the rest of the tribe's children were raised. They were raised in Egypt, in a land that was the antithesis of what Yahadus represented. Okay, so that's what Reb Yaakov. Then Reb Yaakov goes on page Reish Ayin Vav. Okay, and he begins to talk about. Till now, he was talking about Yaakov being makasher Ephraim with Yahadus, with religion. Okay. Now he's going to talk about something interesting because he's not a Zionist. Yaakov being makasher Ephraim and Asher with Eretz Yisrael. Interesting. Okay. He now going to begin to talk. Now the whole new, but it's not really new. Two things they were missing. They were missing some Yadus and they were missing Eretz Yisrael because they grew up in Mitzrayim. So now I got to get them on the path to know that your home is not here, even though it feels like it. Your home is Eretz Yisrael, right? Venera. This is Reish Ayin Vav. Venera she'inyan zeh meduyak ma'od b'psukim elu. That this matter, okay, of Yaakov being mashpia on his grandchildren, Ephraim and Asher, more than anybody else, is in the psukim. The l'chora madua maskir Yaakov Avinu b'dvarav pa'amayim, right? In Eretz Canaan, b'pasuk Gimel nira ilai beluz b'Eretz Canaan, v'shuv b'pasuk Zayin mesa ilai Rachel Eretz Canaan, right? Well, why does he have to? Why did he just say nira ilai beluz or mesa ilai Rachel? What is he stressing Eretz Canaan to them? Okay. Ulechayrat tzionim Tzionim halolu. He doesn't mean tzionim. He means that tzionim, right? Tzionim halolu shall be'eretz Kenan miutarim hein ubishlei meluz efshel lomar mishum shahaya luz acheretz be'eretz acheretz. Maybe Luz, the name Luz, was not necessarily a Jewish name, and therefore it was in other places too. Hutztrich l'tzayin, that it was Luz be'eretz Kenan. Let's say afshe zed dochik tzas. This is somewhat a dochik. Gam efsher, it's a little bit dochik. Gam efsher mepnei shu kara beit el. Right? It says Yaakov called it Beit El v'ulam Luz. Right? Shema ir l'rishona. Right? Then came tzarich l'tzayin hatev, because once you call it Beit El, we don't even know what we're talking about anymore. Yaakov Luza asher beretz Canaan he Beis El. Right. So even in Vayishlach it says Yaakov came to Luz be'eretz Canaan. Why is he stressing Eretz Canaan? So it must be because then it became Beit El, and they wanted to tell you clearly he came to Luz. That was in Eretz Canaan, which is now Beit El. Where else did Rachel die? Right? She died in Eretz Canaan. Right? Now let's remember one thing: that Rachel, more than any of Yaakov's wives, is the grandmother of Ephraim and Menashe. They never met her, okay? But she's their grandmother, okay? And Yaakov's going to be talking about her. V'nira sheYaakov rotza ladgish lahem sheshorsham u'mekorim eina be'eretz shenoldu ba ela dafka be'eretz Yisrael. Here's the Zionist part, right? Yaakov wanted to stress with them that you guys feel too comfortable here. You have to know that your home is Eretz Yisrael. Now, I want to say so. I want to add something over here because I don't know if you remember, but this is extremely an important idea that's brought in a footnote in Divrei Hayomim, in the Das Mikra. He brings Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, his Pirush on Chumash, which we only have for the last 20 years, right? It's not a large Pirush, but we have his Pirush. And he says there, a Chiddush Nora, that Ephraim used to go from time to Eretz Yisrael because he was building there. In other words, since he was the son of Yosef, and they had very much free movement, so he used to go back there. Now, the Rabbi Yehuda Chassid doesn't say what got him to go back there, but it could very well be that Yosef told him, we have real estate in Eretz Yisrael, go back and take care of the real estate. Why? Because he wanted him to know that that's his country. Okay, that's according to Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. So Rabbi Yaakov is saying something, is going to say something very similar over here as well. But in other words, the idea is that Yaakov wanted Bnei Yosef to know that Eretz Yisrael is the home. Okay, we find in Sefer Nehemiah, Kisharotza Tarshasa lekabel rishon livnos es Yerushalayim. When the Tarshasa, now the Tarshasa is, if you learn Sefer Nehemiah, is Nehemiah. His Hebrew name was Nehemiah, but his Persian name was Tarshasa. Okay, that's why some people learn it. Other people learn, no, that was his title. He was Tarshasa. He was the Tarshasa. He was the Sar Hamashkim. Tarshasa is Sar Hamashkim, Shasa. Okay, Lekabel Rishon, Livnot Yerushalayim, Omar. Now, there's a discussion takes place between Nehemiah and the king, Archatasht, his name was. We don't know which king he is, but he's called by not a name. It may be Achashverosh, it may be somebody else. We don't know. Okay, but he's serving the king. Again, here's what you see: Daniel, Chanem Mishol Vazaria, Nehemiah. They're all working for the government. Very interesting. The Jews, they work for the government. Mordechai works for the government, right? He's the Shar HaMelech, and then eventually becomes Mishtal HaMelech, right? Jews are always like that. Some people claim from the Middle Ages that the Jews were like this because they felt they'll be protected if they work for the government. That's why the Rambam was the doctor for the Sultan. He had other patients too, but he made sure to be the doctor for the Sultan. Right? Jews were always felt unprotected, and if the government protects them, they know they have protection, right? So, so he says to the king, "Lekabel rishayon livnot et Yerushalayim." He wants to get a rishayon to build Jerusalem, but he doesn't tell him that. What does he tell him? Amar Madua. The king says to him, "Madua lo yeru." No, he says to the king. The king says, "How come you look so sad? You can't be working for me and look sad. You have to look happy. If you're working for the king, you have to look happy." So he says, "Madua lo yeru fanai." Right? Why shouldn't my face be sad, be bad, right? Yeru, right? It should be, it should be sad. Asher ha'ir kivrot beis avosai, the city of the cemetery or the burial of my father's family, right? Chareva usharea uklu. It's destroyed. The Beit HaKfarot is destroyed, and its gates have been eaten by in fire. Okay. Now he mentions Beit Kvarot, right? So that's a little bit strange. Why are you getting so sick? Because the Beit Kvarot, you have Jerusalem is destroyed. No Beis Hamikdash. The Har HaBayis looks in terrible shape, and he mentions, there's a Beit HaKfarot, the Yerushalayim, that looks terrible. My family's Beit HaKfarot. By the way, some people learned that this is Har HaZeisim. Okay? Some people learned that he was referring to Har HaZeisim, and it was already a cemetery, definitely at the end of the first temple period, maybe before. And I want you to know there's an area in Har HaZeisim that says, Kan Nikbar Chagai Scharia Malachi. Now, again, we don't know, how true that is, but the point is, it was a Beit HaKfarot that's very, very old. Okay? Im ala melech tov ve'im yitav avadech lefanech. If it's good for the king, right? You remember Mordechai and Esther always say this. Im ala melech tov, right? Ve'im yitav avdecha lefanecha asher tishlacheni el Yehuda el ir kivrat avotai ve'evnena, to the city of the kivrot of my father, right? And I will build it. Okay? Harei she'ir kvurata avot mechaveves es ha'makom al b'neim. Reb Yaakov doesn't ask the question, but it begs to be asked. Why are you talking about Beis HaKvaros, right? Talk about that, you have to build Yerushalayim. You want to get permission to build Yerushalayim. Harei she'ir kivrot ha'avot. So he says, you see, that talking about where your parents are buried is mechavevet et ha'makom al b'neihem. So Reb Yaakov says, from here you see a proof that if you want to get somebody to feel at home with another place, you show them the Beit HaKfarot where their grandparents or great-grandparents are buried. Which there's some truth to that. When people go back to Poland, who are completely assimilated, and then they find in the Warsaw cemetery their grandparents or great-great-grandparents, they start to cry. Right? Even though, what do I have to do with Poland? So my great-grandma, but there's a connection to the Beit HaKfarot, right? That's a big thing, right? Whenever there was a Beit HaKfarot in a town in Eastern Europe, you knew the Jews really lived there. If there was no Beit HaKfarot, you knew they just passed through, right? Beit HaKfarot was a raya that we were in this town for the last 300 years. V'lochein kisharotza Yaakov shemenashe Ephraim shenoldu ba'eretz Mitzrayim. He wanted them to know that their source, right, their roots, and the source of their machzavtam, where they were. How do you say the word? There's a word you say when hone is the word hone. Chiseled, right? Yeah. Chiseled, right? Hu be'eretz Yisrael. It's in Eretz Yisrael. Okay. Chazru bir lahem shemakan kvuras Rachel. Uberetz Canaan. V'sham hu gam mekomam batid. That's why he said, your grandmother is buried in Eretz Canaan, right? And don't forget, Yaakov himself said, Al tikbaruni b'Mitzrayim. So what does the Meshech Chochmah say? Why did he want to be buried in Mitzrayim? The Pashup Shai didn't want to be buried in Eretz Tameya. No. The Meshech Chochmah says he wanted to know that I'm being buried in Eretz Yisrael because that's my country, not here. right? And that's why, by the way, you have thousands of frum Jews, very few, I think, secular Jews, but thousands upon thousands of frum Jews who live in England, the United States, Australia, and then when they die, they get buried in Israel, right? You notice it, right? Why are you doing that? You lived in, you lived in Chutzlar, so you bought the farm. So why are you being buried in Israel? The answer is Israel's my home, and I'm showing it by being buried there. So that's what Reb Yaakov over here says. Now, Reb Yaakov never told me this, but he told me a different shot in in um in this whole problem of why Nehemiah doesn't say I want to build Jerusalem, but he says I want to build the Beis HaKvaros. Now the Pashup shot is, and I don't have a Das Mikra on Nehemiah, so I can't really tell you, but I think the Pashup shot is that if he said to him, I want to build Jerusalem, and he said, not so fast, Kowalski. You're not going to, the minute you build Jerusalem, we got problems because you're going to become a commonwealth again. You're going to become a nation and a country. So he said Beit HaKvarot. That's not threatening, okay? So that's what Reb Yaakov once said to me, that's the pshat. But take a look at Yud Gimel here on the bottom. And here's where Reb Yaakov says this pshat, okay? Rabbeinu Hosef shemikroi elu, from these psukim in Nehemiah, yesh lumod gam dover acher. And then he says, the author here says, these words were written in Tafresh Tzadi Zayin, 1937. Okay, and it's important to know that because he's going to be referring to Eretz Yisrael here. Bezelashona, and this is Lechora, V'chilo Motza Hatarshasa, that's the Chemia. Inyan Yosef Choshev Lachshivet Yerushalayim, Rakba Meshi Ir Kivrot Avosav. He couldn't find something more to make to Machshav Yerushalayim except the Beis HaKvaros, right? What should he have said? V'alo Ir Biraseinu, it's our capital. Imakom Migdashenu, it's our Beis HaMikdash. V'od, right? There's so many things you could talk about Yerushalayim, why it's Chashiv to us. It says Harazesim. I mean, can you imagine that? You got to be a real litvak for that. Harazesim is Chashiv, right? Elish Adarabba, Ilmole Hoya Machshiva Kolkach, Lo Hoya Marsheu. If Yaakov said, if the king saw that Nehemiah is Machshiv, Yerushalayim, so he wouldn't let him go. V'rak Makom Kivros Avosef Shezeu Dover Bilti Chashiv. The king wasn't threatened by a Beis HaKvaros. Madua, right? Madua Lo Yarshenu. Why shouldn't he give him permission to go? She'ain zel rikshe regesh prati shalodem prati. He's saying my family's Beit HaKvaros is ruined, right? That's like you saying, in the Warsaw Cemetery, I gotta fix it up, or I gotta fix up the cemetery in Prague. Who's not going to let you go? They don't feel threatened by that. You're just fixing up the cemetery. So that's why he asked him for that. But Lamaisa, when Nehemiah went to Yerushalayim, he started rebuilding it. Okay? V'zui klapi elu she'ovim lagdil pulat hatnuos she'b'Yisrael. And this is, and here he's referring already to the secular Zionists, Zui klapi, I'm saying this against those who love lahagdil pulas hatnuos she'b'Yisrael. They love to talk about what they're accomplishing in Israel. Shekol echad mitchareh im chavero. Everyone competes with his friend. Mafriz ala pulot shapol hu achas egorm sonenu umidanenu umandenu hitchilu beemet domim ki yesh lanu memshalo malchus gemura. He said, this is 1937. He says, there's so many different groups in Israel, each trying to show I'm doing more to build a country than the other. He said, Reb Yaakov was saying, build a country, but don't show off. Because the minute you show off, they start thinking, oh, they want a country. Oh, not so fast. Right?
Reb Shurin, is this footnote your grandfather's words, or this is the
100%. This is my grandfather wrote this in his Ksav Yad in 1937.
In other words, this is mamish. This isn't something that the rabbi added on his own.
Rabbeinu hadvarim nichtevu, he says, b'shnat tofresh tzadi zayin v'zel lashono, and this is the lashon.
Okay.
Right? So it was it was like 10 years before the founding of the state. And they were already working, different groups were working to build the land and stuff like this. And each group, like today in the government, this group says, I accomplished this, and the other group says, no, I accomplished it, and they try to take credit. So he says they shouldn't be saying it so out loud, because then the nations get nervous, right? The minute the Jews are strong, the nation. Yeah, go ahead. Question?
This was Dafka in response to the British, who are raising various partition plans at the time, including 1936, and wanting to partition the land of Israel. So the Jews have to speak up to say, we've done X, Y, and Z, and therefore we deserve this part of Eretz Yisrael. Do not give it to the Arabs.
I hear. So you're saying they had a good reason why?
They've been quiet and sanu about their achievement. Right. So the Arabs.
So Reb Yaakov says, Kol echad mitchare im chaveiro. Reb Yaakov's problem is not the announcement, but more, why are you competing? Why are the two Jews competing? And therefore each one has to be mafriz al midosav. They have to say more than they did. So you're saying they have to say it for the British, but they didn't have to be in competition with each other. That's what Reb Yaakov is seeing a little bit of a problem, that they're competition with each other. But you're right. Reb Yaakov saw this as, he didn't view it as helping them against the British. He viewed it as, you have to try to be as quiet about it as possible so they won't, I'll give you an example where it's still true today. Whenever they made a new settlement, when I came to Israel, right? I don't know if it's true today, but whenever they made a settlement when I came to Israel, it was always done hush-hush. In other words, and then the army found out about it after a month that they were living up there or something, right? But they were always doing it in secret. They brought up a caravan in the middle of the night. They're always doing it in secret. That's the way they were settling, like the West Bank, so to speak, at those times, So that's something that Reb Yaakov is saying they should be more sensitive about from Nehemiah. In order to get permission from the king to build Jerusalem, he had to talk about a Bes HaKfaros. Couldn't talk about Jerusalem. But you're saying that, no, could be it wouldn't have helped if they didn't prove that they could be an efficient government, right? That they can govern. Okay, I hear what you say. Rabbi Yaakov obviously didn't relate to that aspect, so I'm glad you brought it up. But he says, right? Umandenu, the mandenu are people who are also distance us, from the word nidu. Hischilu, be'emes domim, they start already thinking, they think we have a Malchus Gemura, and that's not good for our enemies, he says. Now, I think that today it's very good because we could really defend ourselves. In those days, in 1937, the Jews couldn't defend themselves as well in Eretz Yisrael, right? And Yaakov felt that they shouldn't make such a big, they shouldn't announce it so much. They should just do, right? Anius is good for the Jewish people. Why? Because when the Jews are rich, all the goyim stop being jealous. Ubemis me olam hitnagu avosenu kadmonenu shekol ruchusham lo haye nicker be'enav ha'amim mipnei shekach en kina banu mizel hazeh v'lo mi'am acher. As you know, that the Jews in Eastern and Western Europe, I know more from Eastern Europe, but I think it was Western Europe too. They weren't allowed to wear certain jewelry or all their jewelry because the goyim got very jealous of it. So they didn't want their rechusham lo hay nicker beinei ha'amim b'pnei shekach en kina banu mizel hazeh, ourselves, the Jews, with each other. V'lo me'am acher. Vashem yigdor pirtzosenu v'yishivenu artzenu ge'ulim. And God should, this is his bracha at the end of his piece. God should build a fence of that's broken open, That's what Nehemiah actually did. And bring us to the land of Israel as Geulim, right? And again, Rabbi Yaakov was not a Zionist, so he was looking at Eretz Yisrael. I'm coming to Eretz Yisrael when there's a Geula, right? Of course, Rabbi Yaakov realized later on that it's not going to be like you think, that, we're going to wait in Lithuania or in on the Lower East Side, and Mashiach's going to come and say, come to Eretz Yisrael, right? Rabbi Yaakov definitely realized that wasn't going to happen, right, at a certain point. But at this time, maybe he really thought this. This is just when Reb Yaakov decided to leave Lithuania in 1937. He decided this is probably right before he left Lithuania, and or maybe he was already in America when he wrote this. I don't know. I think it was before he left Lithuania. I got that impression. In any event,
what exactly caused him to leave?
Reb Yaakov left Lithuania because he couldn't find a job. I think he would have stayed. In fact, I saw a Holocaust movie about a guy who joined the partisans in Lithuania. Ashishok was the name of the town. It was much bigger than my grandfather, and he went there to get a position. He went to Plungyan, he went to Ashishok, and no town was able to get the position. Someone beat him out each time. Okay, 3 different places. I don't remember the third place, but I saw a Holocaust documentary in Ashishok, and the rabbi there was killed. It says he was killed. He was taken away, and his son joined the partisans. Okay, but if Rabbi Yaakov would have been the rabbi there, he would have just gone right to the slaughter. There's no question about it. But he had to leave because he couldn't make parnasa. And once he got to America, he saw that there's a lot of room for parnasa there, and he got a job in Toronto, and then he was offered a job in New York. And the Kovner Rav was the one who was smarter than Rabbi Yaakov and smarter than everybody. He said to Rabbi Yaakov, when Rabbi Yaakov asked him, should he leave and go to America, he said, like you, we have 100 in Lithuania, right? But in America, there's no one like you, Reb Yaakov. So that's why he said that he left, right? So he was very smart.
Who said that to him?
The Kovner Rav, Rev Avram Shapiro, said to him, Reb Yaakov, go to America like you. We have plenty Rabbonim in Eretz Yisrael, but in America, don't have anyone like you, right? So that was the one that solved. He got smicha from the Kovner Rav. That was the one who solved it. That was the capital of Lithuania, Kovner, and that's how he solved his predicament, of whether you should leave. Okay, so he says, so that's what he says. Now, Rabbi Yaakov Yesod, that Yaakov was talking to his grandchildren about Eretz Yisrael and stressing that that's your country by saying your grandmother was buried in Eretz Canaan, right? That's something the Meshech Chochmah talks about. Okay, Reb Yaakov talks about 2 different ideas, and they're both in a Meshech Chochmah, a long Meshech Chochmah in Parshas Bechukosai. One of them is that Yaakov asked to be buried in Eretz Canaan to tell the Jewish people, this is not your home. Your home is in Eretz Canaan. And then he has another piece where he talks about the problem of the Jews getting too comfortable in Chutz La'aretz. Okay? And that we'll already talk about next week, but let's finish this piece this week. Okay, so on page Reish Ayin Zayin, ve'efsher shezel shegorim lehem levnei Ephraim shetov v'choshvu et hakates kol zman of 30 shana. Here, Rabbi Yaakov repeats this idea again, that this is what the Bnei Ephraim made a mistake, and they had the Kates 30 years before, because the shibud by them was much more difficult than the other Jews, because they were princes in Egypt before there was a change. Now, Reb Yaakov says this idea again here, but he's going to say it a little bit different. Okay? Because the Bnei Ephraim felt that like they're real citizens of the country. Sharei Avim nolad beretz Mitzrayim, because the Bnei Ephraim's father, Ephraim, was born in Eretz Mitzrayim. So that's why the Bnei Ephraim felt very much like real citizens. Vayakosh aleihim It was very hard for them to feel that all of a sudden they became foreigners. Okay? That was very hard for them. And that caused them to start thinking about the case. Halolu Shavim Isher et Haaretz v'Toshveha. These Egyptians that their father, right? Meaning that means their grandfather, right? Isher et Haaretz v'Toshveha. He made Eretz Mitzrayim rich, Yosef. The one that caused this nation to live, they would have starved to death, right? He made new chukim and good chukim and straight chukim in the land of Egypt. And he brought peace between the nation and the king, meaning the nation was very angry at the king because they didn't have food to eat. And Yosef figured out a way to make them feel good and be supported by the king. Everything was done wisdom. Now, he's going to describe something that's really very interesting. What was going on? What did Ephraim really see? And Reb Yaakov makes this up. He creates it simply, okay? New king comes. What? Question? A new king comes, right? And he doesn't remember any of the schuyot that Yaakov is Magil Yaakov, right? Ubanav hareim zorim, she'en lehem shum schus kiyum ba'aretz. And all of a sudden, his kids, right, don't have any more. His kids are foreigners. They don't have a schus in the land of Egypt anymore. They're not like every other citizen. Pitom. After he makes the whole country wealthy, he builds the whole country, right? What do they write in the history books in the Batei Sefer of this? Rabbi Yaakov makes this up, basically. He says, what are they writing in the schools in Egypt, right? In the Batei Chinuch, that they wrote in the history there was a king whose name was Tzofnas Paneach, and he came here. He was an Ivri that came he was a slave. And we, the Egyptians, right? Bishvil HaZahav. I don't know what this means. I'm not sure exactly what he means by Bishvil HaZahav. Harimu HaMoshlim, the rulers lifted him up, HaKadmonim, the original rulers, Ad Madre Mishnah Lamelech, Moshe B'chol Eretz Mitzrayim. In other words, we did him a great favor. He was an Eved, right? He was an Eved. And what did we do for him? We made him Mishnah Lamelech. We're Tzadikim Gemurim, right? And we allowed him to bring his whole family here. He didn't just bring him and his wife and kids were here. He brought the whole mishpucha, the chamula. And these people that they brought here, they dislike us. They don't eat with us. They don't live with us. And they're waiting for a time of war. And they're creating macharcherim. Macharcher means, what's the English word for macharcher?
War,
not insinuates.
Troublemaker.
What?
A troublemaker.
Troublemaker, right. Macharcherim. I have another word, but I don't remember what it is, right? Not insinuates, but to cause the trouble, right? Macharcherim riv beinenu levein shchenenu. V'oz k'sheyala b'yodam l'kro milchama ba'aretz yisachadum sanenu v'yilchamu banu. Right? They're not loyal citizens. They're different. And therefore, we can't trust them because they're going to create stress between us and our shchenim. And then when they have the ability, they're gonna get together with our enemies. right? In other words, this is the way it was presented in school, Reb Yaakov was saying. Now, of course, where does Reb Yaakov getting this from? He's getting from the whole galut, right? The Jews build up a country, and then, of course, the new government decides that, they hate the Jews, and they're going to show that they actually did a favor for the Jews. This is the part that about Trump that makes me nauseous, right? Egypt, Israel is the one that recently, just in the last few days, the Shin Bet or the Mossad told them that they wanted to assassinate him, right? He got it from the Mossad. That's at least what it said it didn't say in the Israeli news, but in the American news it said it. It said it in the Fox News, right? But what does Trump say? Without us, they wouldn't have a country. Without us, they'd be lost. They'd be destroyed, right? That's what he said. This is similar to what the Egyptians were saying. We took this Eved and we made him a Moshe. We did a tremendous chesed to him, and they stopped talking about what he did for them, right? That's Rabbi Yaakov speaking over here. And he says, and they're not loyal. And of course, in America, they're saying that all the time now. More than any other place, they're saying the Jews are not loyal to America. They're loyal to Israel, right? That, of course, creates the anti-Semitism, right? That is what we call it's the trigger of anti-Semitism, right? And that's what he says. And where he knows how could anyone like Joseph's sons stand in front of being mezulzal, right? Like this, that their father saved the whole country, and now the whole country says that we saved Yosef, right? And that caused them. In other words, till now we knew. I told you that Ephraim felt betrayed, but Reb Yaakov here describes in color, full color, what the betrayal was, right? Not just that Egypt turned on them. He describes what was going on, so to speak, in the schools. Of course, it's all made up because who knows? They probably didn't even have schools then, right? But he says he's projecting this on Egypt from what happened in Eastern Europe, right? In Western Europe, even in Germany. The Germans did so much for Germany, and then of course they said we did them favors, and you can't trust them. They're going to be for the enemy and everything. This is exactly what he says, and that's why Ephraim, more than anybody else, he says, b'fnei zilzulim ka'elu, they couldn't tolerate this anymore. So as soon as they found a cheshbon that you could get out, they got out. Okay. 1 second. Okay, so we'll stop here, and the rest of this piece over here is really the stuff that we had in Divrei Yomim already, and we'll take up the piece I sent you already that starts beginning of Parsha Shmos. Okay, that's what I sent you. It's 2 pages. We'll start that next week, Bezrat Hashem.
At 8:40.
8:40, right. I forgot to announce it. Right, Jonathan's right. We made up in the summer. It should be 8:40, not 8:30, because people coming home from Erev, right, including myself. I won't have to run next week. I could walk, actually. Okay, so we'll see you next week, Bezrat Hashem. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Sure.